Edgar Allan Poe. The murders in the Rue Morgue. The analytical mind. The analytical mind is seldom prone to introspection. We judge it only by its fruits. One thing, however, is known to us. It bestows upon its possessor a pleasure unlike any other. Just as the strong man delights in his muscular power, finding joy in physical exertion, so does the analyst derive enjoyment from the intense labor of thought. Any puzzle that allows him to employ his gift, be it a riddle, a cipher, or a perplexing hieroglyph, brings him satisfaction. The ability to unravel the tangled threads of crime aligns the detective with the mathematician, yet it is a misnomer to call the higher mathematics analysis, for not every calculation merits the name. Consider, for instance, the drafts player. He calculates his moves excellently, yet this cannot be termed analysis. Let us put aside abstract theories and turn to an example. Imagine a game of drafts where only 4 kings remain on the board, and errors due to inattention are thus eliminated. Victory, without a doubt, will go to that player, assuming the opponents are equally matched, whose strategy is more cunning and whose thinking is more refined. Having exhausted conventional tactics, the analyst begins to dissect the very thought process of his opponent and sometimes find a single move, at times absurdly simple, to lure him into a trap or provoke a fatal miscalculation. For a long time, whist has been cited as a game that cultivates calculative skill. Men of the highest intellect find in it an inexpressible delight, while considering chess, on the contrary, a trivial pastime. Indeed, nothing so stirs the analytical faculties as whist. A good chess player is only that, a good chess player, but a skilled whist player will triumph in any arena where one mind is pitted against another. However, one must not confuse the capacity for analysis with simple ingenuity. For while the analyst is necessarily ingenious, the ingenious man is often utterly devoid of analytical ability. In confirmation of this opinion, I relate the following narrative. I was residing in Paris during the spring and part of the summer of 18. There I chanced to become acquainted with a Monsieur Auguste Dupin. This young gentleman was of an excellent, indeed distinguished, family, but through a series of misfortunes had been reduced to such poverty that he had withdrawn from society and ceased to strive for the restoration of his fortunes. Thanks to the forbearance of his creditors, a remnant of his patrimony remained. From its income, he could procure, albeit meagerly, the necessities of life. Books constituted his sole luxury, and in Paris these are easily obtained. Our first meeting occurred in an obscure library on the Rue Montmartre. The accident of both of us being in search of the same very rare and remarkable volume brought us into closer contact. We saw each other frequently. I was deeply fascinated by his family history, which he recounted with the casual frankness of a Frenchman when speaking of his own affairs. I was astonished by the extraordinary erudition of my new acquaintance, as well as by the peculiar fervor and the vivid freshness of his imagination. Seeking in Paris certain materials for my own studies, I realized that the companionship of such a man would be a treasure beyond price for me, and I became sincerely attached to him. We eventually decided to share our lodgings. Since my worldly circumstances were somewhat less desperate than his own, I took upon myself the expenses of renting and furnishing a dwelling suited to our eccentric and mutually melancholic temperaments. I found a time-worn, grotesque mansion, long deserted due to superstitious tales, for such prejudices meant nothing to us, in a remote and desolate part of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Had our mode of life been known, We should have been regarded as madmen. We lived in utter seclusion, receiving no visitors. The location of our abode was a closely guarded secret, and we admitted no one. My friend was fraught with peculiarities. Among them, he adored the night for its own sake. It was his passion. I, too, slipped gradually into this idiosyncrasy, as into all his others. As perpetual darkness was impossible, we manufactured our own night. Having tightly shut the old-style shutters, we would light a couple of lamps, along with powerfully scented candles, and immerse ourselves in reading or conversation until the clock proclaimed the arrival of the true night. Then we would sally forth into the streets, arm in arm, continuing our talks until long after dawn. Living thus under the same roof with Dupin, I could not help but admire his analytical genius. He found genuine rapture in the exercise of this talent, and freely confessed the pleasure it afforded him. He would say with a quiet smile that most men had a window into their innermost being right in the center of their chests, through which he could see everything. His words were invariably followed by immediate and startling proof of his seemingly intimate knowledge of my own soul. At such moments his manner became frosty and abstracted. His eyes would gaze vacantly into the distance, while his voice, ordinarily a rich baritone, would rise to a high treble. Observing him in these moods, I often dwelled upon the old philosophy of the double soul. One evening, we were strolling down a long, dirty street in the vicinity of the Palais Royal. Both of us appeared to be wrapped in our own thoughts, and for a full quarter of an hour neither of us had spoken. Suddenly, Dupin broke the silence. He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better at the Theatre de Varietés. There can be no doubt of that, I replied without thinking, not perceiving at first. So utterly had I been absorbed in reflection that the speaker had precisely articulated the thread of my own thoughts. A moment later, I recovered myself. Dupin, said I gravely, this is beyond my comprehension. I am not ashamed to say that I am absolutely astonished and can scarcely believe my senses. How is it possible you should know I was thinking of— Here I paused, to ascertain beyond a doubt whether he really knew of whom I thought. Of Chantilly, said he. Why do you pause? You were remarking to yourself that his diminutive figure unfits him for the role of Xerxes, or for any such tragic parts. Such precisely had been my thought. Chantilly, who once was a cobbler on the Rue Saint-Denis, but who, stage-struck, had attempted the part of Xerxes in a tragedy by Crébelin, had been derided for his pretensions, which vastly outstripped his talents. For God's sake, I exclaimed, tell me the method, if method there is, by which you have been enabled to fathom my soul on this occasion. The astonishment I felt was profound and inexpressible. It was the fruiter, replied my friend, who led you to the conclusion that the cobbler could not possibly be of sufficient stature for roles like Xerxes and all others of that type. The fruiter, you astonish me. I know no fruiter. The man who ran into you as we entered this street. It may have been 15 minutes ago. The method revealed. I recollected. It was indeed true that a vendor with a gigantic basket on his head had nearly knocked me down just as we entered that very street. But what could this possibly have to do with Chantilly? The connection was completely obscure to me. There was not the slightest trace of charlatanism in my friend Dupin. I will explain everything, he said. To help you follow more easily, we will retrace the entire course of your thoughts step by step, from this moment backwards, to your encounter with that vendor. The main links in the chain run thus: Chantilly, Orion, Dr. Nichols, Epicurus, stereotomy, the street stones, and finally, the fruiter. It is a rare opportunity for anyone to trace the reverse path of their own reflections and discover how the mind arrived at a particular conclusion. This pursuit is one of the most fascinating, and a novice is usually astonished by the apparent incoherence and the vast chasm between the starting point and the end result. Judge, then, the extent of my astonishment when, listening to the Frenchman's explanation, I was forced to admit that he had spoken the absolute truth. He continued, "If I am not mistaken, we were conversing about horses as we turned into this street. That was our last topic, and no sooner had we stepped here than the very same fruiterer, with a huge basket on his head, rushed swiftly past and pushed you directly upon a heap of cobblestones gathered for repairing the pavement. You stepped upon one of the loose stones, slipped, bruised your foot, and became irritated. You muttered something through your teeth, glanced back at the unfortunate heap, and then proceeded in silence. I was not observing you with extreme attentiveness, but observation of this kind has long since become second nature to me. Your gaze was fixed upon the pavement, and you were looking with annoyance at its ruts and irregularities, so that I understood you were still thinking of the stones, until we reached the narrow lane called the Lamartine Passage, where they are testing a new wooden pavement assembled from smooth, firmly joined blocks. Here your countenance brightened. I noticed your lips move, and instantly deduced that you had whispered the word stereotomy, a term used to designate this type of pavement. I knew with certainty you could not utter stereotomy without being reminded of Adams, and thus of Epicurus. And since, in one of our recent conversations, I had mentioned to you how the conjectures of this ancient Greek had been surprisingly confirmed by the latest discoveries concerning nebulae and cosmogony, I was sure you would inevitably lift your eyes to the constellation of Orion. You did not disappoint my expectations, and I was then assured that I had grasped the finest thread of your reflections. Yesterday's feuilleton writer in the Musée, while making cutting remarks about the cobbler who aspired to buskins, quoted the Latin verse we have often discussed, "Perditit antiquum littera primus sonum." I had explained to you that it referred to Orion, formerly spelled Urian, and since in that discussion you were quite vehement, I did not doubt you had remembered it. It became clear to me that you would be compelled to associate Orion and Chantilly in your mind. I read this association of ideas by your barely perceptible smile. You were thinking of the unfortunate downfall of the poor shoemaker. Until then you had been walking stooped, but now you suddenly drew yourself up to your full height. I was firmly convinced that at that very moment you were reflecting upon the puny stature of Chantilly. It was then that I interrupted the flow of your thoughts with the remark that this short-statured Chantilly would indeed be much better suited to the stage of the Theatre de Varietés. The Sinister Chronicle. Shortly after this conversation, we took up the evening edition of the Gazette de Tribunox, and our attention was seized by the following notice. Monstrous double murder. This morning, about 3 o'clock, the inhabitants of the Quartier Saint-Roch were awakened by terrifying shrieks, apparently emanating from the 4th story of a house in the Rue Morgue, occupied by a certain Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, Mademoiselle Camille L'Espanaye. After futile attempts to open the door, it had to be broken down, and 8 or 10 neighbors rushed inside, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. By that time the cries had ceased. The moment the crowd surged in disorder onto the first flight of stairs, 2, or perhaps more, voices were heard from above, speaking fiercely amongst themselves. On the 2nd floor landing, the sound suddenly died away, and a tomb-like silence fell. The neighbors began to search the rooms. Upon entering a large room on the fourth floor, facing the courtyard, the door to which also had to be forced, as it was locked from the inside with the key, all present were stupefied with horror and incomprehension. The room presented a scene of terrible disorder. The furniture was broken and scattered about. The mattress had been dragged from the bed and flung into the middle of the floor. On a chair lay a razor, smeared with blood. In the fireplace, long strands of gray hair were discovered, torn out, it seemed, by the roots. Upon the floor lay 2 gold coins, a topaz earring, 3 large silver spoons, 3 smaller ones of plated metal, and 2 bags containing about 4,000 francs in gold. The drawers of a commode stood open and had apparently been rifled, though many valuables remained untouched. Under the bed mattress, a small iron strongbox was found. It was opened, the key still in the lock, and inside lay some old letters and other papers of little consequence. No trace of Madame L'Espanaye herself was to be found. However, an extraordinary quantity of soot was observed in the fireplace, and upon examining the chimney, oh horror! The body of the daughter was dragged out, thrust head downwards a considerable distance up the flue. The body was still warm. Examination revealed numerous injuries, apparently inflicted by the tremendous force used to cram her into the narrow passage and subsequently extract her. Deep scratches were imprinted on her face, and marks from fingernails, as if death had resulted from strangulation. This response is AI-generated for reference only. After the most meticulous search of the entire house, which yielded no further clues, the neighbors proceeded to a small, paved yard at the rear of the building. There, a ghastly spectacle met their eyes. The body of the old lady, her throat cut with such ferocity that when an attempt was made to lift the corpse, the head separated from the torso. Both body and head were so horribly mutilated as to scarcely retain a human appearance. This entire affair remains an impenetrable mystery, and to this moment, so far as we know, not the slightest clue has been discovered which might shed light upon this monstrous crime. In the next day's edition, we found further ghastly particulars. The drama in the Rue Morgue. A great number of witnesses have been examined, yet nothing has transpired to throw the slightest light upon this dark business. We detail all that has been ascertained. Pauline Dubourg, laundress, deposes that she has known both the deceased for 3 years, having washed for them that entire time. The old lady and her daughter seemed on excellent terms, affectionate toward each other. They were good pay. She cannot speak as to their mode of life or means of support, but believes Madame L'Espanaye told fortunes for a living. She was reputed to have money saved. The witness never met any person in the house on the occasions when she called for or delivered the clothes. She is sure they kept no servant. It seemed to her that the house, with the exception of the 4th story, was entirely vacant. Witness testimonies, a mosaic of fear and omissions. Pierre Moreau, a tobacconist, testified that he supplied Madame L'Espanaye with tobacco, always in small quantities, and sometimes grated into a fine powder. He is a native of the quarter and has lived there all his life. The deceased and her daughter had resided in the ill-fated house for over 6 years. Prior to them, a jeweler had occupied it, who rented out the upper floors to various tenants. The house itself belonged to Madame L'Espanaye. Having grown exasperated with the tenants' untidiness, she eventually moved in herself. The old woman, according to the witness, was already sinking into dotage. He had seen the daughter only 5 or 6 times in all those years. Both led a reclusive life, and were reputed to be persons of means. He had heard from neighbors that Madame L'Espanaye practiced fortune-telling, but he himself does not believe it. The witness never saw anyone visit the house except the old lady and her daughter, occasionally an errand boy, and some 8 or 10 times a physician. The other witnesses, in general, gave similar testimony. No one knew if any outsiders had frequented the house or if the old woman and her daughter had any relatives. The shutters on the front windows were rarely opened. The rear shutters, however, were always fastened tight, with the exception of those on the large room of the 4th story. The house was solidly built and did not appear old. Isidore Muset, a gendarme, deposed that while on his patrol around 3 o'clock in the morning, he observed some 20 or 30 people at the gate of the house, desperately trying to gain entry. Forcing the door proved not too difficult, as it was a double door and was fastened by neither bolt nor bar. The heart-rending shrieks continued until the door yielded on its hinges, ceasing only then. It gave the impression that several people were crying out, uttering screams of inexpressible agony. The sounds were incredibly loud and drawn out. The witness rushed up the stairs. On the first landing, he distinguished 2 voices engaged in a fierce and angry altercation. One, a deep, gruff voice; the other, a shrill and exceedingly strange one. The witness made out a few words from the first speaker, undoubtedly a Frenchman, but it was definitely not a woman's voice. He distinctly heard the swear words, sacrebleu and diable. As for the second, shrill voice, it belonged, in his opinion, to a foreigner, but whether it was a man or a woman was impossible to determine. He could not make out any words, but he believes the speech was Spanish. His description of the room's condition corroborated precisely that of the previous witnesses. Henri Duval, a neighboring silversmith, was among the first to enter the house. He generally confirmed Muset's statement. Immediately upon entering, they locked the door behind them to keep out the crowd, which was beginning to gather in the street. The shrill voice, according to this witness's firm conviction, belonged to an Italian. It was certainly not a Frenchman. He cannot say for certain whether it was a man's or a woman's voice. It might have been a woman's. The witness does not speak Italian. He could not distinguish words, but is confident the speaker was using that language. He was acquainted with Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter and had spoken with them often. He is firmly convinced that the ominous voice did not belong to either of them. Odenheimer, a tavern keeper, came forward voluntarily, without being summoned. He does not speak French and gave his testimony through an interpreter. The witness is a native of Amsterdam. He was passing the fateful house just at the time of the cries. They lasted for several minutes, perhaps 10. They were long, deafening, soul-piercing shrieks, shrieks that would make one's blood run cold. Odenheimer was among those who entered the house. He confirms the previous testimonies, with one single exception. He is sure, as if it were something obvious, that the shrill voice belonged to a Frenchman. He could not discern any words. The speech was loud, hurried, uneven, betraying both terror and rage. The voice itself was more husky than shrill. As for the gruff voice, it repeated several times, sacrebleu, diable, and once exclaimed, Mon Dieu. Jules Mignot, senior partner of the banking house Mignot and Son on the Rue de Lorraine, testified that Madame L'Espanaye was a client of his and possessed considerable means. He had managed her affairs for 8 years, since that very spring. She often deposited small sums with him, and 3 days prior had, for the first time, withdrawn a large sum for 1,000 francs. The amount was paid out to her in gold, and a clerk was dispatched to deliver the money. Adolphe Lebon, the very clerk from Mignot and Son, testified that on the appointed day, around noon, he accompanied Madame L'Espanaye to her very doorstep, carrying the 4,000 francs in 2 bags. When the door was opened, Mademoiselle L'Espanaye appeared on the threshold and took one of the bags from his hands, while her mother took the other. He bowed politely and took his leave. At that moment, the street was utterly deserted. The street itself was winding and quiet, as if fashioned specifically for clandestine affairs. William Byrd, a tailor by trade, was among the first to burst into the house. An Englishman, he had been living in Paris for 2 years. He raced up the stairs as one of the first and distinctly heard the altercation. The gruff voice, without a doubt, belonged to a Frenchman. He caught a few words, but cannot now recall them. He clearly distinguished only sacre and diable. It gave the impression that several people were fighting. The shrill voice was considerably louder than the gruff one. The witness is certain it was not the voice of an Englishman. It was more likely that of a German, or perhaps even a woman. He himself does not speak German. The 4 witnesses mentioned above were questioned anew. They all unanimously confirmed that the door to the room where Mademoiselle L'Espanaye's body was found was locked from the inside. When they approached it, a profound silence reigned. No groans or rustles could be heard. Upon forcing their way in, they found no one. The windows of both the back and front rooms were found to be securely fastened from within. The door connecting the 2 rooms was also locked. The door from the front room to the corridor was locked with a key, and the key remained on the inside. A small room at the front of the house, near the corridor entrance, stood wide open. It was cluttered with old trunks, bedsteads, and other junk. All of this was thoroughly examined. Not a single corner of the house escaped scrutiny. Even the chimneys were explored by sweeps. The house was 4 stories high, with attics. The trapdoor leading to the roof was found to be securely nailed down. It appeared not to have been opened for many years. The testimonies varied on only one point: the length of time between hearing the quarreling voices and the breaking down of the door. Some witnesses asserted it was 2 or 3 minutes. Others claimed as much as 5. The door yielded only with great difficulty. Alfonso Garcia, an undertaker, testified that he entered the house with the first group. He resides on the Rue Morgue, but is Spanish by birth. He did not ascend the stairs, as his nerves are weak, and he has a mortal dread of violent agitation. He heard the voices of the disputants clearly. The gruff voice belonged to a Frenchman. He could not make out the words. The shrill voice, however, he firmly believed belonged to an Englishman. The witness does not speak English, but judges by the intonation and cadence. Alberto Montani, a confectioner, stated that he was among the first to go up the stairs. He too heard the voices. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman, and the witness even distinguished a few words, which seemed to him to be reproaches. He could not discern the speech of the shrill voice, only rapid, staccato sounds. He took them for Russian speech. In general, he confirmed the previous testimonies. The witness is Italian and has never conversed with Russians. Some witnesses, recalled for further questioning, declare that the flues in all the rooms on the 4th floor were too narrow to admit the passage of a human being. Consequently, the murderer could not have escaped through them while people were ascending the stairs. The body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been forced into the chimney with such violence that it required the strength of 4 or 5 men to extract it. Paul Dumont, a physician, testified that he was summoned at dawn to examine the bodies. Both lay upon the bed in the very room where the young lady was found. The body of the younger woman was horribly bruised and disfigured. These injuries were explained by the monstrous force used to thrust her up the chimney. Her throat was lacerated with scratches. Beneath her chin were abrasions and a collection of livid marks, the evident traces of fingers. Her face was terribly swollen, and her eyes protruded. Her tongue was nearly bitten through. Upon the pit of her stomach was a vast bruise, apparently from the pressure of a knee. In the opinion of Monsieur Dumont, Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been throttled to death by one or several perpetrators. The body of the old lady was mutilated beyond recognition. Every bone in her left arm and leg was more or less shattered. The left tibia was splintered to pieces, as were the ribs on the same side. The whole body was dreadfully bruised and contused. It was difficult to conceive what weapon could have inflicted such atrocities. Only something exceedingly heavy, a club, a thick iron crowbar, or some other dreadful instrument wielded by a man of prodigious strength, could have produced such devastation. No woman, with whatever weapon, could have accomplished this. When the witness examined the body, the head was completely severed from the trunk and, like the rest, horribly mutilated. The throat had evidently been cut by some exceedingly sharp instrument, probably a razor. Alexander Etienne, a surgeon summoned at the same time as Monsieur Dumont, fully corroborated all his conclusions and observations. The police were utterly confounded. So extraordinary a crime offered not the slightest clue. The investigation had reached a dead end. The evening papers merely confirmed that intense excitement continued to reign in the Quartier Saint-Roch. A second, even more meticulous examination of the premises had been conducted, the witnesses reinterrogated, all without the slightest result. A postscript to the account mentioned that Adolphe Le Bon, the bank clerk, had been arrested and imprisoned, although no compelling evidence appeared against him. Dupin seemed to be extraordinarily intrigued by this affair, yet he remained silent. It was only upon learning of Le Bon's arrest that he asked me my opinion concerning these murders. I was forced to confess that, like all Paris, I considered them an insoluble mystery. I saw not the slightest avenue by which the murderer could be traced. The trail was cold. We need not trouble ourselves with imagined possibilities, objected Dupin, particularly after so superficial an investigation. The Parisian police are often praised for their acumen, and they are indeed cunning, but only in their way. Do they possess a true method? Nevertheless, before we theorize, we must see with our own eyes. We shall go to the site and examine everything ourselves. I am acquainted with G, the prefect of police, and we shall have no difficulty in obtaining the necessary permission. The permission was obtained, and we proceeded to the Rue Morgue. It was one of those dismal thoroughfares which connect the Rue Richelieu with the Rue Saint-Roch. We found the house without difficulty, for a crowd of gawkers, with a stupid and greedy curiosity, were still staring at the shuttered windows. It was an ordinary-looking house, with a front door and a porter's lodge in the entrance. Before entering, we walked down the street, turned into a side lane, and examined the rear of the building. Dupin studied the house and its surroundings with a meticulousness I found incomprehensible. We then returned to the front entrance, rang the bell, presented our authority, and were admitted inside. The house remained in the same state of chaos recorded in the initial inspection. With the thoroughness of a surgeon, Dupin examined even the bodies of the unfortunate victims. Having been through all the rooms, we descended to a small paved yard at the rear, accompanied of course, by a gendarme. Our examination lasted until late in the evening, and we left the house under the cover of night. On our way home, Dupin stepped for a few minutes into the office of a daily newspaper. I have already mentioned my friend's idiosyncratic ways, to which I habitually indulged. He now took it into his head not to utter a single word about the murder until the following day. It was only then that he asked me, suddenly, if I had observed anything particular at the scene of the crime. There was something in his intonation of the word particular which caused me to shudder. No, nothing particular, I said. At least, nothing more than we both saw stated in the paper. The Gazette, he replied, has not, I fear, grasped the full audacity of this atrocity. But we need not concern ourselves with the ignorant opinions of the press. It strikes me that this mystery is considered insoluble for the very reason which ought to have made it soluble. I mean the outré character of the crime. The police are confounded not by the absence of a motive, but by its monstrous brutality. Furthermore, they are baffled by the riddle of the voices. How could shouts have come from a room from which there was no egress without encountering the crowd on the stairs? The strange disorder, the body thrust up the chimney head first, the frightful mutilation of the old lady's body. All this has paralyzed the police and led them astray. Yet in cases such as this, we should inquire not how the crime was committed, but in what it differs from all others. I have found the key to the mystery precisely in what made it appear insoluble to the police. I gazed at my friend in mute astonishment. At this moment, he continued, casting a glance toward the door, I am expecting a person who, though perhaps not the principal actor in this bloody drama, must have been involved in it. It is possible, indeed probable, that he is innocent of the murder. I cherish the hope that I am not mistaken in this supposition, for upon it I build my expectation of unraveling the entire riddle. I look for him here, in this room, every moment. It is true that he may not arrive, but the probability is that he will. Should he come, it will be necessary to detain him. Here are pistols, and we both know how to use them, should the occasion arise. I took the pistols, scarcely knowing what I did, or believing what I heard, while Dupin went on. The voices heard in contention, he said, by the party upon the stairs, were not the voices of the women themselves. This is fully proved, and relieves us of all doubt upon the question of whether the old lady could have first destroyed her daughter and afterward have committed suicide. I speak of this point chiefly to show you the futility of that supposition, for Madame L'Espanaye could not have had the strength to thrust her daughter's corpse up the chimney as it was found. The nature of the wounds upon her own person entirely preclude the idea of self-destruction. The murder, then, was committed by some third party, and the voices of this third party were those heard in contention. Now, let me direct your attention to a peculiar point in the testimony regarding these voices. What have you observed? I remarked that, while all the witnesses agreed in supposing the gruff voice to be that of a Frenchman, there was much disagreement in regard to the shrill, or as one individual termed it, the harsh voice. That was the evidence itself, said Dupin, but it was not the peculiarity of the evidence. You have observed nothing distinctive, yet there was something deserving of notice. The witnesses, as you remark, agreed about the gruff voice. They were here unanimous. But in regard to the shrill voice, the peculiarity is not that they disagreed, but that while an Italian, an Englishman, a Spaniard, a Hollander, and a Frenchman attempted to describe it, each one spoke of it as that of a foreigner. Each is sure that it was not the voice of one of his own countrymen. Each likens it, not to the voice of an individual of any nation with whose language he is conversant, but the converse. The Frenchman supposes it the voice of a Spaniard, yet admits he does not understand Spanish. The Dutchman maintains it to have been that of a Frenchman, but we find it stated that this witness, not understanding French, was examined through an interpreter. The Englishman thinks it the voice of a German, but he knows no German. The Spaniard is sure that it was the voice of an Englishman, but he has no knowledge of the English tongue, judging by the intonation. Now, how strangely unusual must that voice have really been, about which such testimony as this could have been elicited, in whose tones even the nationals of 5 great European countries could recognize nothing familiar. You will say that it might have been the voice of an Asiatic, of an African. Neither Asiatics nor Africans abound in Paris, but without denying the inference, I will now merely call your attention to 3 points. The voice is described by one witness as harsh rather than shrill. Another says it was quick and unequal. No words, no sounds resembling words, were by any witness mentioned as distinguishable. The juxtaposition of these contradictory testimonies is quite sufficient to arouse suspicion and point towards the true path to unraveling the mystery. The suspicion which arose in me, based on the testimony concerning the voices, led me to examine the room with a specific purpose in mind. Let us now return in our minds to that room. The primary question is how the murderers managed to escape. The doors were found locked. The chimney was too narrow. The police had taken up the floors, scrutinized the walls and ceiling, but discovered no secret exits. The room has 2 windows. One is unobstructed and fully accessible for inspection. The lower part of the other is blocked by the massive headboard of a bed, pushed flush against it. Inspection showed that the first window was securely fastened from the inside. It withstood witnesses' attempts to open it. A large hole had been bored in its frame on the left side, revealing a nail driven in almost to the head. Upon examining the second window, a similar nail was found. Opening the sash proved equally impossible. The police, satisfied that escape via the windows was untenable, did not bother to draw the nails for verification. My examination was more thorough. I needed to prove that this impossibility was merely apparent. I reasoned thus. The murderers escaped through one of the windows. Consequently, they could not have refastened it from the inside, as it was found. Since the windows were fastened, they must have shut themselves. No other conclusion was possible. I felt sure I would find a spring mechanism, and I was not mistaken. Having discovered and pressed it, pleased with my find, I did not even bother to open the window. I replaced the nail and examined it attentively. Had a person, upon exiting, slammed the window shut, the spring bolt would have caught, and the nail could not have been in its observed position. This consideration was pivotal and simplified my inquiry. The murderers must have used the other window. Assuming the fastenings to be identical, I needed to find a difference in the nails or their installation. Climbing upon the headboard, I scrutinized the second window from top to bottom. Reaching my hand over, I pressed the spring of the bolt. It was the same. I then looked more closely at the nail. It was as stout as the first and seemed similarly driven in up to the head. You will perhaps think I was disconcerted by this discovery. On the contrary, I had made no error, nor had I lost the logical thread for a single moment. I had traced the secret to its ultimate point, and that point was the nail. Though it outwardly resembled its counterpart in every respect, herein lay the true solution. There must be something amiss with this nail. I touched it. The head, with a portion of the shank, came off in my fingers, while the remainder stayed fixed in the bore. The break was an old one, The edges were rusted, and it had clearly been caused by the blow of a hammer which had driven the head flush with the frame. I carefully replaced the head and shank, restoring the nail's appearance of wholeness. Pressing the spring, I gently opened the window. The head moved with the sash. I then closed it, and the nail once again appeared intact and firm. The riddle was solved. The murderer had escaped through the window near the bed's head. Whether the window closed of its own accord or was purposely shut, it was held by the spring bolt. The police, attributing this fastening to the nail, saw no need for further investigation. The next question was how the culprit descended from the window. I was pondering this as we walked around the building. About 5.5 feet from the window runs a lightning rod. To have reached the window from it would have been a formidable feat, and to have entered through it, nearly impossible. The shutters on the fourth story are of a peculiar, old-fashioned kind, now fallen out of use. Such may still be seen occasionally in Lyons and Bordeaux. They are constructed like a single door, with a lower latticework section, the bars of which offer a handhold. The shutters are about 3.5 feet in width. When we inspected them, they were half open. That is to say, they stood out at right angles from the wall. The police, in examining the house's rear, likely overlooked the breadth of these shutters or deemed it unimportant. Having decided that escape via the windows was impossible, they conducted their search half-heartedly. It immediately struck me, however, that if the shutter by the bed's head were thrown fully back against the wall, it would reach to within 2 feet of the lightning rod. It became clear to me that, with a wild and preternatural agility and courage, one could have entered the window by using the rod for support and the latticework as a foothold. By taking a firm hold of the shutter, the perpetrator could have swung himself directly into the room, had the window been open, and then flung the shutter back into place. Bear in mind, I speak of agility scarcely human, required for so hazardous an undertaking. My aim was to demonstrate, first and foremost, that escape was possible, but my primary objective was to draw your attention to the incredible, almost superhuman dexterity it demanded. It is evident that the criminal entered and departed by the same route. Now, let us return to the interior of the room. It has been suggested that the bureaus were partly ransacked, while articles of clothing were left undisturbed. This is but a supposition, and a rather feeble one at that. How are we to know that the objects found in the drawers constitute everything that was once there? Had a thief been at work, what reason would he have to leave 4,000 francs in gold, carrying off only a bundle of linen? The idea of robbery, therefore, is untenable. Now, consider these facts together: the strange voice, the incredible agility, and the absence of any apparent motive for such ferocity. Let us analyze the murder itself. Here is a woman strangled by bare hands and thrust head down into a chimney flue. Ordinary criminals do not kill in this manner, nor dispose of bodies thus. You must agree that this method of concealing the corpse is most extraordinary and runs contrary to human logic, even for the most depraved of villains. And what Herculean strength was required, given that several men could scarcely extract the body from its narrow confines. Consider, too, the other evidences of this superhuman power. Upon the hearth were found thick tresses of gray hair, torn out by the roots. You are aware of the force needed to wrench some 20 or 30 hairs from the head at once. Yet here, whole tufts were torn away, with the very scalp attached. The old woman's throat was not merely cut. Her head was entirely severed from the body by an ordinary razor. Mark, too, the brutish savagery of this act. I say nothing of the injuries upon Madame L'Espanaye's body, which might have resulted from a fall from the fourth-story window, a possibility the police overlooked, being so certain the windows were fastened. What conclusion do you draw from these facts? Preternatural agility, animal ferocity, motiveless butchery, a strange voice whose utterances no representative of 5 European nations could recognize as his native tongue. The murder was committed by a madman, escaped from a nearby asylum, I suggested. Not altogether bad, replied Dupin. Your idea is nearly correct. But the voice of a madman, even in his fiercest paroxysms, does not correspond to the descriptions given of this voice. Furthermore, the hair of a madman is not such as I now hold in my hand. I disentangled this little tuft from the rigidly clenched fingers of Madame L'Espanaye. What do you make of it? Dupin, I exclaimed, completely overcome. This hair is most unusual. It is not human hair. I did not assert that it was, said he. But before we decide this point, look at the sketch I have made upon this paper. These impressions are clearly those of fingers. Here, observe, continued my friend, spreading out the paper. Do you not see that the grasp was one of prodigious strength, and that there is no slipping of the fingers? Each seems to have remained exactly where it was first planted until the victim expired. Now, try to place your own fingers upon these outlines. I attempted, but could not stretch my own to match the span. Perhaps, resumed Dupin, we are not conducting the experiment correctly. The paper lies flat, whereas a human throat is cylindrical. Here is a billet of wood, nearly the same circumference as a neck. Wrap the drawing around it and try again. I did so, but the difficulty became even more obvious. This, I said, is the mark of no human hand. Read now, said Dupin, this passage from Cuvier. It was a minute anatomical description of the large orangutan of the East Indian Islands. I understood it all at once. The description of the digits, said I, as I finished the passage, corresponds exactly with your drawing. No animal but an orangutan, and specifically one from Borneo, could have made such impressions. This tuft of tawny hair, too, matches Cuvier's description. But the particulars of the double murder still puzzle me. The witnesses heard 2 voices, and one was unmistakably that of a Frenchman. True, and you will remember that the witnesses were nearly unanimous in attributing to the gruff voice the exclamation, "Mon Dieu!" One witness described the tone as one of reproach and expostulation. Upon that word, I built my hope of fully unraveling the mystery. Some Frenchman was cognizant of the murder. It is possible, indeed probable, that he was innocent of any participation in the bloody transactions. The orangutan may have escaped from him. He may have traced it to the chamber, but, under the appalling circumstances prevailing there, could not recapture it. This is all mere supposition. If this Frenchman be indeed innocent, as I suppose, then the advertisement I left last night at the office of Le Monde, a paper widely circulated among seafaring men, will bring him to our residence. He handed me the newspaper, and I read, "Caught, early on the morning of the date of the murder, in the Bois de Boulogne, a very large, tawny orangutan of the Bornese species. The owner, who is ascertained to be a sailor, belonging to a Maltese vessel, may have the animal again upon identifying it satisfactorily and paying the charges of its capture and keeping. Apply at No, Rue, Faubourg Saint-Germain, 3rd floor. But how do you know the man is a sailor and belonging to a Maltese vessel?" "I do not know it," said Dupin. "I am not sure of it. But here is a small piece of ribbon, which, from its greasy appearance, has evidently been used in tying the hair in one of those long queues of which sailors are so fond. Moreover, this knot is one which few besides sailors can tie, and is peculiar to the Maltese. I picked the ribbon up at the base of the lightning rod. It could not have belonged to either of the deceased. If I am mistaken in my inference that the Frenchman was a sailor and from a Maltese vessel, then my advertisement will do no harm. If I am right, however, a great point is gained. The Frenchman, cognizant of the murder but innocent of it, will naturally hesitate to reply to the advertisement. He will reason thus: I am innocent. I am poor. My orangutan is of great value. To one in my circumstances a fortune of itself. Why should I lose it through idle apprehensions of danger? The animal was found in the Bois de Boulogne, at a vast distance from the scene of the butchery. Who can suspect a brute beast of such indeed? The police are baffled. They have not even stumbled upon the faintest clue. Even if they were to trace the animal, how could they prove I knew of the murder, or how convict me for that knowledge? If I do not claim my property, it may lead to suspicion. It is better, then, that I go and retrieve the beast. The denouement, an unexpected visitor and a monstrous truth. At that very moment, the sound of hurried footsteps ascending the staircase reached our ears. Be on your guard, Dupin said quietly. Take the pistols, but do not use them or show them until I give the signal. The entrance door was unlocked. The stranger entered without knocking, ascended a few steps, then suddenly hesitated, and we heard him begin to descend. Dupin rushed to the door. Immediately, the footsteps were heard upon the stairs once more. This time, a knock sounded at the door. Come in, said Dupin, cheerfully and cordially. A man entered, whose appearance at once marked him as a sailor. A stout, muscular figure with a sun-tanned, bold, yet pleasant face, largely concealed by dense whiskers and a mustache. In his hand he clutched a heavy oaken cudgel. He bowed awkwardly and muttered a greeting in a patois that betrayed a Parisian of the lower classes. Pray be seated, my good sir, said Dupin. I presume you have come about your orangutan. I congratulate you. He is a creature of rare beauty and, no doubt, of considerable value. How old might he be? The sailor drew a deep breath of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and replied firmly, Can't say for certain, sir, but I reckon 4 or 5 years old. Is he here? Of course not. Where could we keep such a beast? He is secured in a livery stable on the Rue Morgue. You may reclaim him at dawn. But can you prove your ownership? Yes, sir, without a doubt. I must confess, I am sorry to part with him, remarked Dupin. I understand, nodded the sailor. You've taken trouble, and your trouble ought to be paid. I'll gladly reward the man who caught him. Within reason, of course. Very good, replied Dupin. That is all quite fair. But what will you offer? And do you know what reward I particularly desire? Tell me everything you know about the murders in the Rue Morgue. Dupin uttered these last words in a very low tone and with the utmost composure. With the same unruffled demeanor, he walked to the door, locked it, put the key in his pocket, then drew a pistol from his breast pocket and laid it, with equal impassivity, upon the table. The sailor's face flushed crimson, as though he were on the point of suffocation. He started up and grasped his cudgel, but the next instant fell back into his seat, trembling violently and having turned as pale as ashes. He could not utter a single word. I felt sincerely sorry for him. My friend, said Dupin, in a tone of the deepest kindness, you are alarming yourself unnecessarily. We mean you no harm, and I pledge my honor that we bear you no ill will. I know you are innocent of the murders in the Rue Morgue, but this does not mean you are entirely unconnected with the tragedy. From what I have said, you may gather that I have some means of information. The full picture is now clear to me. You could have done nothing to prevent the atrocity, and you bear no guilt for it. You have nothing to conceal and no reason to hide. On the other hand, you are, by principle, an honest man, and are therefore bound to tell all you know. An innocent man is now imprisoned, accused of the crime whose details are known to you. While Dupin spoke, the sailor gradually recovered his composure, though his former boldness had entirely vanished. "God help me," said he, after a brief silence. "I will tell you all I know, though I don't expect you to believe half of it. It's foolish to hope, but I have a clear conscience. I will relate everything, even if it costs me my life." The substance of his story was this. He had lately made a voyage to the Indian archipelago. Landing with some companions at Borneo, they had ventured into the interior on an excursion. He and a shipmate had succeeded in capturing an orangutan. The companion died shortly after, and the beast became his sole property. After great difficulty, occasioned by the animal's ferocity, he had at length managed to bring it to Paris, where, to avoid attracting the troublesome curiosity of his neighbors, he kept it closely confined in his own lodging until such time as it should recover from a wound in the foot, received from a splinter on board ship. His ultimate design was to sell it for a considerable sum. Upon that very night, or rather, in the early morning of the fateful day of the murder, he had returned home from a carousing session with some seafaring companions, and found the orangutan occupying his own bedroom, into which it had broken from the closet where it was supposedly locked. Razor in hand, and fully lathered, it was sitting before a looking-glass, attempting the operation of shaving, in which it had no doubt previously watched its master through the keyhole. Terrified at the sight of so dangerous a weapon in the possession of the animal, the man was for a moment paralyzed with horror. He had been accustomed to quiet the creature, even in its fiercest moods, with a whip, and to this he now looked for his salvation. Flinching at the sight of it, the ape sprang at once through the door of the chamber, dashed down the stairs, and thence, through a window, unfortunately open, into the street. The Frenchman followed in despair. The ape, still clutching the razor, occasionally stopped to look back and gesticulate at its pursuer until the latter had nearly come up with it. It then again made off. In this manner the chase continued for a long time. The streets were profoundly quiet, as it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In passing down an alley in the rear of the Rue Morgue, the fugitive's attention was arrested by a light gleaming from the open window of Madame L'Espanaye's chamber in the 4th story of her house. Rushing to the building, it perceived the lightning rod, clambered up with inconceivable agility, grasped the shutter, which was thrown fully back against the wall, and by its means swung itself directly upon the headboard of the bed. The whole feat did not occupy a minute. The shutter was kicked open again by the orangutan as it entered the room. The sailor, both rejoiced and terrified, had hopes of now recapturing the brute, while the latter was largely occupied with the interior of the room. The thought of the mischief it might do, however, finally spurred him to follow. Climbing up the lightning rod was not difficult for him, but when he had reached the height of the window, which lay far to his left, he could but barely peer into the room, at which point the horrifying spectacle within caused him to nearly lose his hold and fall from his position. It was at this precise moment that the dreadful shrieks, which had first awakened the inhabitants of the Rue Morgue, were heard. Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, still in their night clothes, had apparently been occupied in examining some papers in an iron chest. The chest lay open, its contents scattered upon the floor. The women sat with their backs toward the window, and from the time elapsing between the ingress of the beast and the screams, it seems probable that they were not immediately aware of its presence. The flapping to of the shutter would naturally have been attributed to the wind. As the sailor looked in, the gigantic animal had seized Madame L'Espanaye, who was likely occupied in arranging her hair, by it, and was flourishing the razor about her face in imitation of the motions of a barber. The daughter lay prostrate and motionless. She had swooned. The screams and struggles of the old lady, during which the hair was torn from her head, aroused all the fury of the beast, whose aims might initially have been playful. With one determined sweep of its muscular arm, it nearly severed her head from her body. The sight of blood inflamed its anger into frenzy. Gnashing its teeth and flashing fire from its eyes, it flew upon the body of the girl and embedded its fearful talons in her throat, retaining its grasp until she expired. It was then that its glance fell upon the countenance of its master, rigid with horror, at the window. The fury of the beast, who no doubt bore still in mind the dreaded whip, was instantly converted into fear. Conscious of having deserved punishment, it seemed desirous of concealing its bloody deeds. It tore frantically about the room, scattering furniture and strewing contents in its path. Finally, it seized the corpse of the daughter and thrust it up the chimney as it was found, then that of the old lady, which it immediately hurled through the window headlong. As the ape approached the window with its mutilated burden, the sailor shrank aghast to the rod and, rather climbing than dropping, slid hastily to the ground, fleeing in terror from the consequences of this terrible nightmare. The voices heard in contention were his own exclamations of horror and the fiendish jabberings of the brute. All else is known. The ape must have escaped from the chamber by the rod just before the breaking of the door. It must have closed the window as it passed through it. It was subsequently caught by the owner himself, who sold it for a large sum at the Jardin des Plantes. We communicated the full details of the case to the prefect of police, and Monsieur Lebon was instantly released. Thank you for your attention. To not miss the premiere of the next story, please subscribe to the channel. Your thoughts and impressions are the best reward for us.